name is Ruth Nyakerario, and I'm so excited to be in Sera and Sauti. Been looking forward to this. Oops, did I just say that? My debut in podcasting, and I'm so excited to be having a conversation with Mwangi Mwaura, who's a dear friend, a thought partner, and previously a colleague. In terms of introduction, I am a researcher and a writer. My work has heavily focused on forced displacement, but I'm expanding that to include how people make livelihoods in urban cities, especially individuals who are not indigenous to that city, refugees still and migrants. But to focus on Mwangi, Mwangi's work offers a layered view of how used clothes navigate global and local systems, from valuation processes in the global north, particularly in the UK, to precarious economies in Gikomba. His ethnographic mapping, audio and visual storytelling methods foreground the lived realities of traders and communities. I could go on and on sharing what Mwangi does, but that's the whole idea of this podcast, for us to hear and talk about his incredible research, which I think does stand out. And I really appreciate him for bringing this knowledge to the world about Gikomba. Welcome, Mwangi.
Thank you so much, Ruthie. It's such a joy to be here. It's such a joy to be hosted on Sera na Sauti. Big kudos to Sumaya for the space she's been creating and the whole team. The previous episode have been really like eye-opening on a few things, and I deeply feel feel grateful, but also feel warm, like a sense of warmth to be in the space of like the other guests who have been on the podcast. So thank you for the generous introduction, Ruthie. I deeply appreciate that. And it's such a joy to have this conversation with you, my dear friend.
Oh, thank you. Well, I'm glad you say it's such a joy to have this conversation because I have loads of questions which I think our listeners will find interesting. To just get us started, I'm curious to hear why you chose Gikomba. How did you land on Gikomba? I remember when you first met, you had interest in urban geographies and how individuals navigate the urban spaces, especially in global south. But how did you land on Gikomba? And then that will lead us to another question I'll ask on the same.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Rudy, for that question. Like the question of Genesis. Genesis can be so many things. Like my life, my work, which I guess all comes to be my life here. I would say did set me up for Gikomba and set me up for secondhand clothes. So as a background, I grew up in Muranga myself. So I grew up in Muranga County with a dad who is a tailor and my mom who was also a tailor, but my mom did not practice tailoring. At least by the time I was growing up, she was already out of that industry. And that's actually how they met. So there's always that intention to, on that acknowledgement, there will be you clothed me with clothes from the word go, I guess. Anyway, so I grew up around fabrics in so many ways. Both seeing people come to get clothes that my dad has delayed on. Yeah, we know typical Fundi story. Could say that more, and like, yeah, hopefully my dad will listen to this and laugh and not get mad at that. In 2017, when I joined university for undergrad, I was studying at Pioneer International University, which is just located at Ngara. I had to live with my auntie who stays in Gikomba. So my auntie has been in Gikomba from around 1990s. She was married there. So her partner, the husband, was born in Gikomba and has lived in Gikomba all through. So what people don't know is like in Gikomba, it used to be an estate, a civil servant, I think, estate. So with an area called Bondeni, which is just inside Gikomba at this point because it's already submerged into being part of the market. So I had to stay there for 2 months. We know, when you're living in rural Kenya, you're coming to town, both for economic reasons, like yeah, as my dad was setting up like how to move into a hostel, I had to stay in Gikomba. And there was this aspect of when you grow up in rural Kenya and you go to particular schools. So I went to a school, boarding boys high school, where there was all this conversation of Nairobi as the fun city, Nairobi as this place that works, Nairobi as this place where you'll be, ferried by these loud matatus that are club and all that kind of stuff. So I was really excited to come to Nairobi. And Gikomba being the first place I lived in, immediately sparked something in me. There was this sense of like, oh my God, there is the infrastructure degradation, there is the market that works in particular with them in particular ways that are hard to understand for a little boy who getting used to it, not even as a trader here, but as someone who is living within that market. Like my auntie's house is submerged with, you have to go through stores and vibandas before you have to go past the area where the bras and like boxers are sold. You have to go past the trouser area called Kwashosho. If someone is familiar with Gikomba geography, they will know that area, to go into her house. And then her house, they've built like this extension by extension with iron, what are they called? Like mabati, like so people live there, but also most this act as storage for people. So you find like tailors who are working in Gikomba or traders who work in Gikomba have rented out this housing which are made by iron sheet. And there's so much degradation of this neighborhood or this estate in terms of like the resources, because when you have more people and like the garbage system is no longer working, the water system, the electricity system. So there was this sense of disappointment, I would say, about coming to Nairobi and realizing all these kind of things that you have to put in context. And for me as a Muranga boy, there was this aspect of I need to understand this more. So my journey was such that I did not start with Gikomba with my research. I first did research in other spaces, and this is when I was doing my undergrad and did my attachment at the British Institute in Eastern Africa and worked with a few geographers, but they were studying other spaces. There was the study of Madare, Enya, Buruburu. So I've written some bit of work on this other neighborhood. So when I got a chance to do my PhD on my DPhil, as we called it, at the University of Oxford, there was that return to that geography that was my first introduction to Nairobi. And I think that would be the best way to describe that genesis of why Gikomba.
Wow, thank you so much, Mwangi. Actually, I did not know that your first debut in Nairobi was in Gikomba. And when you were describing that, I could picture the housing, because Gikosh, how we used to call it back at our home, has specific traditions tied to it. So if you're starting a new job, or if Christmas was just about to hit, or if you needed, my mother's a teacher, and so during holidays when she'd find time and little money, everybody had a time to go to Gikosh with mom, because it meant getting
Ah.
new clothes. And I can picture where you describe the brass spaces. I used to hate the brass spaces because my mother would take so long there. I wasn't wearing brass then yet. And if anyone is in doubt, I'm a woman. So
And negotiating prices, bra
I
prices.
know,
Like our
but I
mother.
remember the houses. I could actually see them.
Oh
And
yeah, yeah.
exactly. And thanks for mentioning University of Oxford, because I forgot to make a proper introduction on what we're talking about. So we in this episode we are exploring how global West economies, urban governance, and everyday survival intersect at Nairobi's Gikomba market. And Mwangi has just given us the genesis of why Gikomba, because his doctoral research traces secondhand clothes from UK, particularly global north, particularly UK, sorting warehouses to Nairobi's informal markets and connecting their circulation to urban disposability, southern urbanism, and livelihoods. That takes me to my next question. What's the history and origin of Gikomba as a political space?
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, you mentioned that it was set up as a space for civil servants.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Perfect, perfect. I would say this is very much work in progress. I just I would say officially, but like time-wise, it's not yet the start of my second year of the PhD, but I've started my field work. That's why I'm in Nairobi at the moment. So whatever I say here is still like a part of work that I'm doing at the archive, just trying to trace the history of Gikomba. How did Gikomba become to be the place we know it today? And the sense so far is like during the establishment of colonial rule in Kenya, in the 30s, in the 20s, we have lots of Black Kenyans come from, Kiambu, from other areas of the country to just come and like earn a living in Nairobi. This is after the introduction of hajj tax, which forces people to leave rural Kenya and come into the city. But also that migration, I don't want to just simplify it as like people are coming to just look for, to make money to pay taxes. There's so many other conversation about like, there are quite a number of books that have explored that aspect of like why people left rural Kenya to Nairobi, and the kind of opportunities and work they were getting in Nairobi and how they were navigating Nairobi. This is the time when Kipande system gets introduced and all that kind of stuff. And we have traders who are selling, or hawkers who are selling on Nairobi streets, which become a very political thing. We see dispute between Kenyans or like these migrants who are selling vegetables on like, we even see like Riverside Drive, is mentioned in some of the documents I'm reading. Most roads then used to have not the names they have at the moment. So they were named Amba something, but also they had names of, Queen Elizabeth and King what and what. We know the names, and like a scholar I read has written a whole PhD on the naming system in Nairobi and how it changes. If we can add that as note, but she's called Melissa. So there's people like these Kenyans are selling on the street, and the government needs to do something because the white population is complaining of the dirt that these Black people have brought to the city. And other communities, including the Indian communities who have dukas, are complaining that these people are selling on their verandas. And nothing has changed. You can see the whole contestation of like hawkers selling on the streets of like Nairobi, how they're always running battles with the hawkers. So that was a thing that was happening. And around 1939, 1940, 42, 40, around that period, they are all taken to go sell from another geography because the solution needs to be found. So traders are taken from the streets of Nairobi, they're dumped into Gikomba, because by then Gikomba was still there was space, and the population then in the comparison to now was not as big. So they're taken to Gikomba market. This time they're not selling secondhand clothes or clothes, they're mostly dealing with vegetables, fish, and some cereals and everything. And that, for me, at least so far from my reading of the archives, is the genesis of Gikomba. Also, please note, this is around the time that a few years after there will be the emergency, the period of emergency is introduced in efforts to fight Mau Mau, the Land and Freedom Army. And there's lots of organizing that is happening in like these trading spaces. So the government is afraid, the white government in particular is afraid of the kind of having all these workers and like hustlers selling on the street. So there's lots of effort to move people around into like a specific geography so that you can try control the Black bodies in cities. So that's the genesis of Gikomba as a geography. The story continues, and something I'm working through, or something I'm researching in my archive, through the archives and through oral histories in Gikomba, is the history of fire. So we see a fire is mentioned 1942. I just saw that in the archive the other day. And after that, we continue to see fires up until maybe last year. What I did not mention, a part of the reason that why Gikomba for me, was when I was staying with my auntie. Within those 2 months, there was a fire that almost burnt the house. And this is a rhythm they have to go through every 6 months. I think there was a period when fires were such a common thing in Gikomba, and they continue to be a thing. I think 2 months ago, there was a small fire at the shoe section. So this is part of how the geography continues to be made and remade through the fires, through the policing of body, through the policing of trade. And yeah, so if I could say that, I could say more into that as we continue this conversation, but also to state that secondhand clothes become a thing in the 80s in this market, and it's illegal to sell secondhand clothes during that period. So that's something I'm working through the archives until it becomes legal later on during Moi's era, I think around 1995, almost like 5 or 10 years before he leaves power. So lots of things to work through as you study and think through Gikomba.
Oh my, you're tempting me to do a PhD. Can you take a research assistant?
We can do this project and it's big enough. Like, let's do it.
A couple of questions, Mwangi. We'll come back to the fire thing, but do you know the origin of Gikomba as a term? Is it Swahili? Is it English? Is it Kikuyu?
Uh,
Yeah, is it a mix?
That's a really good question, because it's something I'm trying to get a sense of from some of the old folks at the market or like at the neighborhood itself. One thing so far, Gikomba, I'm Kikuyu, like very clear from my name, I guess. In Kikuyu, when credit is called Gokoba, like Okoba Nini. So a few people have indicated this is the genesis, but as it as continues with naming and everything, there's always like debate around things. So, but that's my sense, and I think that's what I'm working with in my head at the moment. And this is a whole conversation about other names of neighborhoods in Nairobi. I think there was a good thread that had been done by Chao, like the Headstrong's historian. I think she goes by that name on social media, about different names of places in Nairobi and how they attach themselves to Maasai and Kikuyu names and all that. So I'm getting a sense that Gokomba translates to Gikomba, and yeah.
Okay, interesting.
Mhm.
The other question is around informality. Um,
Mhm.
I think informality amongst traders, from what you've shared with us, leads to the people who are formally occupying Nairobi, white
Mhm.
folks,
Yeah.
other communities, to see them like, let's take that informality somewhere else.
Yeah.
And and the policing, which was still happening then, still continues to happen today, with hawkers being chased everywhere. And
Mhm.
I would be keen to hear what policing looks like within Gikomba. But
Mhm.
tying that to the fire thing, what's the cause of the fires? Yeah, because it's been a recurrent thing. You've mentioned as early as, did I get you right? 40s?
Yeah, as early as 1940s, yeah.
Mhm.
So I'm working through this, but if you were to look at the history of fires in like Nairobi generally, there is a good paper by an anthropologist historian called Arson and something and the making of Nairobi. And she traces, her name is, I'll get the name and I'll mention it before the end of this episode because I'll just open my Zotero for that. She looks through fires in different neighborhoods, particularly markets around Nairobi. And I remember it distinctly, I was so like there was that shock when you realize that this is a pattern. So Gikomba gets a fire in around 1942. There's another fire, 1952 is when the year of emergency, the emergency was declared, right? There is a fire at Bama Market, Bama, the one on like Jogo Road, on the day or like a period around the emergency year. And remember the emergency, I think the biggest stroke for the emergency to be declared was the killing of the chief Warohio. And there is also a killing that happens close to Bama Market around the same period of a government official, black government, a Kenyan official, and immediately 2 hours or 3 hours after, because there's chaos that elapsed because of the kind of policing as the police are trying to get who has killed this particular person. I can't remember the name of the Kenyan guy who was killed. Bama Market is banned. Then that paper goes to an extent of showing other fires within like in other neighborhoods. So there's a big history of arson and fires in around Nairobi. If you think through the fires that we continue to see in neighborhoods such as Mathare, such as Mukuru kwa Jenga, such as Kibra, there's always a fire almost every year somewhere. And now we also have the stories of flooding per se. So if you're thinking through the story of fires, I think for me, I'm putting it in context as and thinking of it as this ridiculous kind of necropolitics or governing bodies through violence and governing bodies through death and killing. So that's the sense of how that's the sense those are the terminology and framework I'm thinking through when I see that fires continues to happen from 1942 up until like 2 months ago. There was a fire. You then see a fire in the archive. The biggest fire in Gikomba recorded so far was a fire that happened in 2000 September, and like, there was a fire that went for 5 days, and that's the fire that like burned the whole of the market section. Then and the neighborhood was not touched on where the houses are, but there was also houses inside the area that is now cleared in a market area, not cannot be considered a residential area. So that's the biggest fire. Another big fire I think was around to 208, if I remember this well from the newspaper archive. So there's a long history of fire, and it dates back to colonial governance or colonial ways of governing like black bodies in cities, but also in rural areas. I think fires have also been documented like in the burning of neighborhoods or like villages in like rural Kenya during that period of like the war for independence and like establishment of the colonial rule. So yeah, there's much to be said about fires as a form of governance.
Well, thanks for shedding that light on to us, Mwangi. If I was to use this mic as a host, I'd say for anyone who needs a host, I'm more than happy to be one because I'm learning so much in the process. I'd
Mhm,
want us to come back to the fire bit when we talk about disposable geographies,
mhm,
because I'm really keen to tease out the idea of informal infrastructure from
mhm,
you. Is it electrical faults? Is it a policing thing, as you are arguing? Is it an in-house thing that is done by fellow traders? Curious
mhm,
to come to that. But for now, I just want us to touch on something you mentioned, that when Gikomba started, it was a market that where individuals sold fruits like vegetables and meat and stuff like that. But the 80s, you mentioned secondhand clothing happened. Could you help
mhm,
us trace the history of secondhand clothing? And
mhm.
maybe there's someone who's listening and has just never sat down to understand where these clothes come from.
Okay, perfect, perfect. Happy to do that. Happy to do that. So, there's an amazing book called like Salaula, which is like by a historian anthropologist again. I don't know why the names of these scholars are escaping me today, but the book Salaula, I'm just getting the name because this is now ridiculous.
Yep, proper citation, please. We're serious.
Exactly, exactly. I can't afford to like do this. So this book, it's not by Brooks. By Hansen, yeah. This book by Hansen, it's a 2000 book, traces secondhand clothes on the continent to as early as the World War. So she traces how there were like military garments from like Europe during the First and Second World War found their way into Zambia, and I would imagine this is the same situation in Kenya and Central, like Eastern African region, East African region. So there's all that, but what happens in the 80s and 90s is like we have fast fashion start to become a thing. We have companies, and we have like this aspect of consumerism. Like we have hyper consumerism starts to take shape in the as a social thing, as a cultural thing in the global north, but also in the global south. So I do not want to say that it only happens in the global north. And we get big brands such as I will name brands here, such as M&S, Zara, like Shein, which is like if someone buys from Shein for me, or sometimes I feel like it's a consolation point if I have to say. So we have all these brands that are like encouraging and like are producing so much clothes into the system, and people are just consuming clothes as short within short period as 1 month of like I will get a summer stuff, or I will get a winter jacket that cannot sustain itself to another winter. So what happens in the global north, as a few people will know, like most people will know, is like if when you stop using your clothes, you donate them to charity shop. So again, in the 40s, in the 80s, in the 90s, around that, well, in the 70s to 90s, there's like a structural adjustment program on the continent, and there's all encouragement of like a government to leave to stop interfering with life and let like businesses, so that businesses can make their own thing. And there's scholarship that shows or connects the rise of charity shops and the rise of charity organization in the global north towards the aspect of the global north citizens trying to figure out, now that our governments are not doing projects on African continent, in the Asia, in the global south, how can we step in? And how that's how charity shop, which mostly are like for fundraising to support projects such as issues to do with climate issues, like homelessness, like refugee aspect and all that kind of stuff. become attached to charity, and then a way for charity to make money become like being a donation center for youth clothing. So you see things are happening on different aspects of our social and cultural life and economic life that connects to charity shops. So you donate your clothes to charity shop. Charity shop, for example, in the UK that I'm volunteering at as part of my methodology, like my research method, will sort out clothes and decide what will be sold on their counters on their shelf for a few weeks. If something is not sold there, it's passed down or sold to what are they called, recycling company or exporters who then package things in bales so that they end up becoming like our mitumba or like our second-hand clothes on the continent in other parts of the world. So what happens here which is interesting, is like you immediately see something donated as charity gets a life as a commodity, as a capital commodity. And also think of that aspect of like charity shop that are fundraising are fundraising for project on sustainability and this kind of stuff. We have Oxfam, British Heart Foundation, and so many other in different parts of the world. Salvation Army in the US, Goodwill in the US. They become this organization that turn a commoditized charity into a product that is a charity into a capital commodity. And in the 80s, as fast fashion is happening in 90s and 2000s, the commodity they are receiving as charity donation are too much. They are surplus for them to consume within the UK, for example. So they have to find a way to give somewhere. And here I have to say, like, a big belief in the kind of work I'm thinking through, and scholars who work on the waste system and waste system discard study. We say that for any waste system in a place to work, there have to be another geography or another place has to be created as another that can be dumped into. That what happens even in Nairobi, if you think that we have to have a Dandora dumping site so that we can live in Kinelesha, we can live in Kilimani, we can live in Runda and Karen as clean spaces. We have to have a dumping site. So that's the same thing that happens globally, that we need charity shops become a place for white folks to feel okay that they're contributing something to the world, or like they're not wasting things, or they're not the people who are directing throwing things to the dumping site. And also because they're fundraising spaces, they're helping an organization make money to support homelessness and all this kind of aspect, both in their countries but also in the global south. So that's how secondhand clothes become a thing, both in the 80s from the 80s mostly to 2000. That's when this is like establishing itself as a big industry. And also here, maybe also to state that the same book that was referring to Salaula by Hansen, the book that was published in 2000, states clearly that from her work, it was clear that high quality secondhand clothes goes to a particular geography, particularly Japan. It was that period. Medium quality goes to Latin America, and the worst quality is dumped into the African continent, which is something from my work with volunteering. You can tell when these decisions are being made, like this is like a bit ripped here, this is a bit torn here, so this will not be resold here in this charity shop. It will just be sent to the exporters or to the recycling people who then export to other parts of the world. It's also clear, I'm glad that we started this conversation about Gikomba with the bra section. In the UK, there is a law, or I don't know whether it's a legal act or like whether it's just a corporate act, where bras and intimate clothes are not sold in charity shops. If you can think about when you visited a charity shop, you've not seen secondhand clothes, bra, boxers, jock strap and everything. But these things will be found on the continent. So you can think through geographies of bodies and all those kind of terminology to try and make sense of what is happening here.
I feel like I need a break for my mind. I'm getting angry.
I get you. I think like doing this work is consuming all this kind of information and seeing the global system as like this thing that has not changed. It's like racial capitalism at its core, it's colonialism. You cannot use all this kind of terminology to think what is happening, in this system.
Yeah, racial capitalism, which makes me want to bring in an aspect which I think is key for your work, critical race theory. But before we go there, I just wanted to find out, let's take Oxfam, for example. So they sort out through the clothing, and I'm a huge fan of charity shops. When I lived in the UK, I dressed mostly from charity shops. You can really, if you need an outfit for something, just walk there, and you look as new as like you've gotten your clothes from M&S and all. So you
Mhm.
get the really good quality, right? You'll never get
Yeah.
anything that's torn.
Mhm.
So there's a decision that's, from what you've shared, there's a decision that's made. Certain quality goes to this country, this country.
Mhm.
Um, at what point does it become trade? Because
Uh-huh.
at what point, how, like, paint for us a picture of how these bills come into Kenya. The
Uh-huh.
exporting happens, and there's certain kingpins who are the ones who are in charge. Because I know people who've made wealth and
Yeah.
millions of wealth from
Mhm.
Gikomba. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So to go with the first, like that you mentioned, like at what point does this become trade? I would say immediately the commodity is donated to the charity shop, because immediately it comes as a free thing by its turn into a commodity. Even if it's sold in the UK, you have to pay your £2, £3 for something. But there is that continuous aspect of it being a trade and a commodity when it's sold to the exporters and exporters and recycling man, who would then, the most, from my sense at the moment, is like most of the bales are not packaged. At least they are not vacuum packaged and everything in the UK. Most of these commodities transported to places, geographies such as Pakistan, which is becoming interesting in my field work when you're chatting with traders, and they will tell you, yeah, this trouser is from Canada or this trouser is from the UK, but it's packaged from Pakistan. And a trader was asking me the other day of like, why do they package in Pakistan? And I was like, ooh, I actually don't know as much, but we can think through like cheap labor in Pakistan and cheap labor around that area of like Asia, where and it's interesting because also most of the commodity, if you need through your like cloth tag, will say made in Bangladesh, made in Pakistan, made in what. So the commodity still ends there. So I wonder who is doing research in that area to just like make sense of like what is happening. But also a few African countries are like packaging areas. So for example, Tunisia, and this is a conversation we can have shortly about how different African countries have positioned themselves in this global secondhand cloth industry. Tunisia, because it's close to Europe, is a packaging area. Tunisia, I think, even had a rule that secondhand shoes, I don't think it's like for every commodity, but shoes in particular cannot be resold in the country, but they can be imported for packaging in Tunisia. So Tunisia's position itself as a place for packaging, but it has to go out immediately. So that's what mostly happened. The packaging does not happen in the UK, for example. It mostly happens from other geographies where it's sorted out again and graded. So the bells in Gikomba are always, there's grade 1, there's grade 2, there's grade 3. So these are very clear packaging of like good quality. There's like a grade 1, grade 2, grade 3 is like when you open a bell that is grade 3, like we did yesterday. I was at the market yesterday, and like the trader was selling with, because my method is like ethnography and I'm selling with traders. So I'll sell with the trader for like a whole day or like a half a day. We opened 3 bell, and one was second grade bell, and one was that grade. And then that grade clearly only gave us like 3 camera in a quantity of like 100 pieces. So there is that aspect of like they know what they are sending, but you as you buy as a trader, you really don't know. It's like a lottery game of like, yes, I know I'm getting that grade because it's cheaper, but sometimes it will surprise me and give me some things that I can salvage. Sometimes it will just give me things I just want them out of my store as soon as possible. So this is all that we can discuss. But yeah, that's what happens. There's packaging geographies, mostly around Asia, but also, as I've stated with the case of Tunisia, there are some African countries like do play that role. Before then, it ends up in places like Kenya, Zambia, Uganda. Yeah, that's the sense there.
Wow, 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 wow. Lots of questions. Lots of questions. There's something I wanted to say. Do you mind, for any listener who might not understand what camera is?
Oh, yes, 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 yes. I love that. Yeah, we keep going to the aspects of terminology. Gikomba is a place to think terminologies. We just talked about what was the origin of the name Gikomba, which I'm still trying to get a fuller sense of. Camera is technically like, the camera we use to take photos and all. And it's you can make that sense of like, because camera is the good quality from a bale. When you open a bale of 100 pieces, a trader will first sort them out into camera, second camera, third camera, or like whatever will be left is always called fagia. So another terminology is introduced. So camera is the good quality, fagia is what they throw away at throwaway prices. I'm just sweeping it away because fagia means sweep away. like sweep away something or sweep out something. So yeah, lots of linguistic thing for a researcher like myself who is interested in this kind of genesis
I'm
and terminology in a market.
I'm so glad we're having this conversation because you can be living in a space, moving around a geography. Look at me also in terminology, but never really engage with the history or even like a whole livelihood and ecology, political ecology that goes on in such a space. Yeah,
Mhm.
I wish everyone can listen to this. I want us to jump a bit. We'll come back to how people have made a livelihood. We'll talk about the traders and all
Mhm.
from Gikomba and such spaces. But I want us to walk back to racial capitalism and
Mhm.
how your engagement with critical race theory, and if you could
Mhm.
explain to us like you're explaining to 12-year-old kids,
Mhm.
because I'm keen to learn also,
Yeah.
how does it relate to your work? Really bringing in the idea of packaging geographies, bringing the idea of the different grades and why
Mhm.
some grades find themselves here. Yeah.
Mhm. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much, Ruthie, for that. And my best teacher on racial capitalism, or the best teacher for me, at least at the moment, is Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who is an abolition geographer, who says like for capitalism to work, like it has to have inequality is part of capitalism. Inequality, and particularly capitalism has found a good grounding on ratio inequality is the thing that supports and like enables it to occur, or like to be the current mode of like I guess I can't even say economic, because it's translating into a social life, religion, like culture. Everything is like very much like made through racial capitalism at the moment. So racial capitalism and like critical race theory, because it's like critical race theory is like the big word, and all these other theories and like frameworks and concepts will fall under, and racial capitalism falls under like that aspect of critical race theory. Just gives us eyes and ways to think through global system, but also the manifestation of those global inequality and also local inequality within even the subset of even a family unit. Like you can see racial capitalism in a family setting if that's the kind of work you're doing as a researcher. So for me, with my research, both having fieldwork in the UK and having fieldwork in Kenya, I'm thinking through racial capitalism, or like racial capitalism critical race theory offers me the language to think through the sorting process of like clothes in the UK that determines that bras cannot be sold in the UK, but they can be sold on the continent, as a thing that gives us as as a as a process that gives us an instance to like an instance not to capture, because I'm lacking a word here, but an instance to like visualize and see clearly how racial capitalism works, that black bodies on the continent, or like bodies in the global south can have this, but for us we're going to protect our people, or we're going to have whatever. And then racial capitalism also, and like a critical race theory um also gives you a sense to think historically about the fires of Gikomba as a governance thing of like biopolitics, or like necropolitics, as actually Cameroonian scholar calls it, necropolitics, that aspect of governing through death and violence and everything that we have seen the Kenyan government do in the last, and so many other government do continuously. So yeah, those I would say is the aspect of like what critical race theory and racial capitalism in yeah, to try break it down to like to the basics of it, is like racial capitalism works on inequality, and the inequality here is like the race, it's the racism is the inequality that manifests itself, or like that's sustained and is sustained by capitalism. And remember, capitalism will always defend itself and fight for itself in so many ways. So inequality is part of the way, or the tools that it uses to fight itself, and fight for itself, not fight itself. I hope that was helpful to some extent.
Yeah, it was helpful. So for those of us who are questioning how should we not consume
Mhm,
secondhand clothing,
mhm,
and should we consume, which
mhm,
leads me to the question of livelihoods. We have
mhm,
countries such as you've mentioned, Tunisia, which serves as
mhm,
packaging center, and
mhm,
we have countries like Rwanda, at least from
mhm,
my last bits of research, which bar the selling
mhm,
of secondhand clothing.
mhm,
then Kenya is open, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah.
Let's talk about this dilemma where it's offered a sense of livelihood to so many people.
Yeah.
It's home for some people. There's people
Mhm.
who've been educated through Gikomba. Um,
Mhm.
there's people who've been able to climb up the social ladder through
Yeah.
Gikomba. But
Yeah.
also, this is a space which I don't know whether I'm using the word correctly. Is like a disposable, like urban space.
Yeah.
So it's also causing so much harm to the community, to the environment. What happens to all those clothes? For example, you opened a bale and only
Mhm.
take out 3 camera. What happens
Mhm.
to all the other clothing? Because I'd be very hopeful to think of us having a very like robust recycling system.
Yeah.
So talk to us about this duality of livelihoods versus damage to the environment.
Perfect. Thank you, Ruthie, for that question. And this is something I continue to insist with my research, and probably this, I hope this can be edited and it be part of like the starting of the podcast, where my research does not seek to think of like banning secondhand clothes or mitumba in Kenya, a conversation that always comes up every 2 years. Every government comes in and starts to think of like banning mitumba, and then there is like a debate about how that will destroy livelihood. My research does not seek to support like an aspect of banning secondhand clothes. And here I'll mention this later about extended producer responsibility. There are people who are thinking through framework that can make this industry a bit more fairer, and like make the producer of fast fashion and the producer of fabric who continues to insist that we have to use virgin cotton instead of like recycling whatever is in the system, the person who is paying more. Because here it's an aspect of, if a trader has to deal with like opening a bale only to find 2 camera, then that's inequality. But if a trader can be assured that if I open a bale, I'll get 50 camera and the other things can also be salvaged. But if they can't be salvaged, there's a way, like the producer is the one who is paying more, for that. So yeah, my research does not seek to support like such a claim. My research seeks to think through such frameworks that wants to make that such framework as the extended producer responsibility. So livelihoods in Kenya, we probably have over 10 million Kenyans who support their livelihoods, or who survive and live and thrive through selling second-hand clothes, mending second-hand clothes, engaging ironing, both in Gikomba market but beyond Gikomba market. We've seen how many people like go to this market to buy things so that they can go sell as far as Kakuma refugee camp, or like to go sell in Congo, or to go sell in Uganda, or to go sneaking them to Tanzania. Look, so this is like Gikomba and Nairobi and Mombasa, like an entry point for all these this commodity, and also like a support of so many livelihoods. So and here what I'm thinking personally with my research in Gikomba is like there's all this kind of mending work that happens with clothes. So when I say that they will only get 3 camera clothes from a bale, I do not mean that they are going to throw 97 trousers into the ground. There is something to do with those. So you find that when they select the camera and they sell them for a good price, they would select second grade, which there will be a specific trader who comes to buy, who then will find in the evening at like Koja, or like Riverside, not Riverside Drive, but River Road, or like another place, because that's what happens. Like the traders I'm working mostly with are people who open bales and fast sell to traders and not individual consumers. Like for example, if me and you go to buy something in Gikomba, or if probably you've gone to Gikomba and you've found a trader opening a bale, and they insist, oh, sichague kwanza, or don't pick first, someone these are for this trader. So there's that market ecosystem that I'm also interested in here with my research. So, and then there is like the menders, there's the tailors who survive from this commodity, there's the ironing people, there are people who will there's a whole section in Gikomba where they make children's clothes from other materials in Gikomba. So they will buy hoodies that cannot be sold because they're very bad, and they will cut the hands of the hoodie and make trousers from that. So there's all this creative kind of stuff that are creative activities that are happening in Gikomba market that that interest me as ways to think of like revaluing this commodity once it gets here. And here is where I say that secondhand clothes industry is actually supported by people in the global south who have to do all this kind of creative stuff or all this kind of marketing. And here, creative stuff include when you go to someone in Gikomba and they tell you this trouser is from Canada or this shirt is from somewhere. They're adding a value to it by just that statement. They're giving it life. They're giving it they're giving it a selling value for you to buy it for as that. When they tell you this is a Nike and you can tell it's a Nike that doesn't have an eye, or you have seen all those kind of things about branding. You find a Zara called Zura or something. There's all this kind of stuff that is happening in the global south or global majority, depending on which terminology you use there. That are the aspect that sustain livelihood, that sustain the trade, that sustain sustainability, if you were to think of it that way, that sustain the circular economy that has to be so that life is made here. So that's another big part of my research, like just sitting with these activities and sitting with all this complexity of this industry. So you see, to go to your question about different countries, Rwanda for sure banned secondhand clothes in 2016, which was a ban that I think came into effect in 2019, which was actually supposed to be an East Africa community, East Africa community not process, act, I think it was passed by EAC, only for Uganda, Tanzania, and Kenya to pull out of the deal a year after, when the Trump government, that was like Trump's first administration, threatened that if you do that, we are going to limit the benefits that you get from the AGOA, which is the Africa. What does AGOA mean again? So there's that trade agreement that was signed by most African countries with the US in the 80s or 90s. I can't remember the exact date, that they were threatened that would be the benefits of that would be limited. And actually Rwanda had to suffer some of that repercussion of just standing on ground and saying that we're not going to allow secondhand clothes to enter our and I think it's secondhand clothes and shoes. So when I say secondhand clothes, I also means all these other commodity that we consume on the body are part of that big brand secondhand clothes. So we have such a country, and we have other countries such as Ghana, which has been the biggest importer of secondhand clothes until recently. I think the statistics shows that Kenya is now leading in that. We have Uganda, Nigeria, the same, and then we have Tunisia and other global North Africa countries that are import sorting location or geographies. So there's lots, and here just to say, there's also an interest and an assignment for people for folks who've been listening to this podcast is to just think through the terminologies different countries call secondhand clothes. So I think in Ghana it's called white dead man's clothes. I think in Sumaya could confirm later, it's called who died or something. And then in other geography it will be called, what we can ask ourselves why it's mitumba for us. It's mostly because I think of the bales packaging, mitumba. I think that's where the terminology comes from. So there's lots of politics, there's lots of friction, there's lots of linguistic things to pick as you think through secondhand clothes in different parts of the world.
Wow. This isn't in the script, in case anyone thinks there's a script, but I remember the first time I went to the US, I was in undergrad. And remains one of my, and this is actually the fact that it remains one of my life-changing opportunities is the question that I have. I remember coming back, and I was living close to Buruburu, and Mtindwa is also an informal market, smaller in size compared to Gikomba. Was my sister and I used to have bonding sessions there, standing next to the guys just when they're opening up the bills. And there was this women specifically who'd stand there and control. And then once they sort, then everything else is thrown to us. And I remember seeing, oh, H&M. Oh my God, it's H&M. Forever 21. It's Forever 21. And I'd buy because it's a brand. And I feel like there's this, when you talk about Canada, oh, this trouser is from the US, or this trouser is from here. There's an exceptionalism or essentialization of the global north staff as the best. will it ever get to a point where we are also donating our clothes? And they're sold in
Uh-huh.
secondhand markets. And I
Uh-huh.
think that brings I don't know if it's a race thing or it's
Mhm.
a global development thing.
Mhm.
Yeah, so in as much as we're continuing to think of ourselves as woke, and I'm here
Mhm.
speaking loosely because it's not everyone who thinks that way, there's
Mhm.
this thing of stuff coming from white folks as better, and even
Mhm.
if you're calling us to think about terminology.
Mhm.
That's just a thought that I have. I don't know that it's a proper question, but if you want to respond to it, that's
I,
fine.
I have
Yeah.
something I can say around that. So yeah, good to even shout out to like someone. There's a brilliant lady called Janet Shemitai. You can find her work on most social medias, particularly TikTok, I believe, and IG. And Janet goes by slow fashion educator. And there's a statement that she told me the first time we met, that people consume brand. And this sounds like this is a statement anyone can say for sure, but it was like very particular from Janet, whose work has been to advocate against like fashion finding its way here, and also show the kind of like ecological harm both at Dandora but also at Gikomba market when you go to the river that cuts across the Gikomba market. And Janet thinks for her that people consuming brand is the problem, particularly in the global north, where people will go for any clothes at Zara, M&S, and all these other places because they have a summer sale or because they have a new style for summer or winter this period, or spring. I don't know whether people buy for spring, but I assume they do. Yeah, and also, having said that, then I go to something else and say like, yeah, shall we ever be the ones who are donating our African made, like a Kenyan made commodity? So if you're to think, commodities are actually also made in Kenya. We have, is it called APZ, like which is a big industrial space. You can ask about why that happens to be here, but most of that commodity is not sold in Kenya. It's like, made for other brands in the global north. And, labor question comes there about like, we don't have a minimum wage for traders or like for workers that work there. Same situation as I was mentioning with in Asia. And then the question, to add to the question of like, shall we ever get to that place of donating our own clothes? There's been massive research that looks into the impact of secondhand clothes importation into the African continent in different countries and how it affected our industry, our apparel industry. So there's a clear link. And here I want to say there's research that support that, and there's also research that pushes against such an analysis of like secondhand clothes started being a thing in the continent, and like for example in Kenya, and then our local textile industry failed. We can make that claim for sure. Statistics, and like when you think with scholars who obsess over quantitative data, will insist that there is no way to show that correlation. But I think it makes sense to like move with that argument, at least to some particular extent. But also to mention here and to do another kudos to a group called Africa Collect Textile, which is an NGO that has a few dropping center in a few malls in Nairobi, where if you're done with your clothes, you can donate to them, and they find ways to make value from them. So they will make tote bag. You've seen me with my pink tote bag, which is a very beautiful bag that I love. They make so many other things, like what we call upcycling. They make carpets, they make mattresses, they make all this kind of pillows and everything for this commodity from the secondhand clothes that are donated to them by Kenyans. So Kenyans do also donate in what can be thought as like charity shop, but they are not really charity shop. But also such an organization, in here to say that my work is also thinking through designers and such organization and educators who are thinking through fast fashion and like secondhand clothes and slow fashion and all this kind of like and this industry in general. So they, Africa Connect Textile, also work with Kenyan brands, such our Kenyan corporate organization, including security firms, such that when they're done, or their soldiers or like their workers are done with like clothing, they donate or they sell them to Africa Collect Textile. Africa Collect Textile makes product for them. So it's like a system, like different people and different organizations are thinking through ways of sustainability in the fashion industry. in very interesting way, including in Kenya. I know there's an organization in Nakuru that had an upcycling event or workshop yesterday and today being the 17th of July, that was to just show people how to tengeneza or mend clothes in their own houses. So these are some of the things that different people are working through and thinking through. So there's so much we can learn from just following some of this organization and people. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Mwangi. We're almost coming to an end, and I want to take you back to the beginning. At least when we first met, I remember you were working very closely on looking at the question of Southern urbanism. If you could walk us through like the thought process of why is it important to even think of urban cities and planning and governance and urban life, and then juxtapose what is envisioned as an ideal urban city or urban planning or an ideal what like governments envision African cities would be like vis-a-vis informal markets, which sort of disrupt informal markets, and I can say informal settlements, which disrupt the whole idea of what this city should be like. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ruthie. And I forgot to push back a bit earlier on the word informal market, informal settlement. And this goes to explain like the Southern urbanism as a concept and Southern urbanism as a theory and everything that the work that has been happening in like urban studies the last 10, 15 years. So I would say I tend to think of informality these days as like informalized settlement, informalized like market, because these places are produced to be this way. Like this neighborhood are produced to be this way. You know, when you see someone complain, oh, people in a certain particular neighborhood are tapping water from people in a particular neighborhood are tapping water from the water connection. Why was the water like a water pipe cutting across the neighborhood to go to serve another neighborhood that is richer? That's why they have to do that, because water is not provided. Or like these people houses have been built to them, affordable housing has been built to them, and they're refusing to live in those houses, and they continue the informality thing. No, they are produced. The economics depend on living where they are, so you have to think with them. And we can have instances such as Mukuru Special Planning Area, which was like continues to become a good example of how government, NGOs, and other stakeholders can think about like changing a neighborhood or like making informalized settlements into a better spaces that have access to all these kind of services. So the last 15 years or the last 20 years in like urban studies and geography, the discipline of geography, we've seen work come from like the global south that is called Southern urbanism. The necessity of this work is that in the 80s, in the 70s, there was a whole agreement, at least not a written one, maybe even a written one, we can say that cities in like Africa are not cities. They were never considered urban spaces, because urban spaces have flashing buildings, have, you know, lights everywhere. They have, you know, tall buildings. They have all these kind of like things that are seen to be urban. Then sometime I think this work starts around 2000. If I'm not wrong, at least I can think with one book called Splintering Urbanism that thinks through urban infrastructure in different spaces and shows how, because there was this sense like an urban space needs to have full sewage system. An urban space needs to have, you know, transport that looks a particular way. Then in the early 2000s, people started pushing back and like showing urbanism in the global south or global majority as urbanism that needs to be thought of and theorized and like contribute to urban studies and urban theory and urban geography. So that's where the Southern urbanism concept came through, and it has really provided lots of like concept, frameworks, ways of thinking, urban planning that is no longer trying to just shift a neighborhood such as, I would say, Madare, Kibra into a riverside or into like in a day, we can even think of those spaces as like aspiration these days, because we have also seen what has happened with all the hyper urbanization, with high-rise building without considering the services of sewage and water and everything is something that cannot sustain those tall buildings. So that's what Southern urbanism has done. So we had all that pushback I did some work in 201 with a journal called Urban Geography, where we read through articles that particular journal had published in their 40 issues by the time it was 2000. This was 2021, 2022. I'm a bit hazy on like the dates. But we saw that among their 40 issues, only 40 papers had been written from the African continent, or had been written with a city in the African continent. And the papers that started that conversation in the 80s, because there was a paper that decade of 80 to 90, only maybe 2 papers. There were papers in South Africa. Then South Africa again appears with 3 papers in the decade between 1990 and 2000. And those papers were very much about like economic and development in Joburg, in Cape Town. Should this be thought as a city or not? Then papers start rising after 2000 because there is enough pushback then that cities don't have to have connected sewages as like as the definition of a city, or like markets that are like roofed and everything. So Southern Urbanism provides all that work. And a good instance also to maybe give a concrete like example here is like the scholarship that has been happening on urban infrastructure. So urban infrastructure here has been pushed as a word to define both people as infrastructure. There is a scholar, an African scholar, Abdul Malik Simon, based at the University of Sheffield, who wrote a famous paper in 2004 that defines people. And the case study there was like people in Joburg living in unoccupied buildings, or like deserted buildings, and how they survive. They only manage to survive or live in Joburg because they are attached to particular people, or they know who to go to so that they can get this thing. So there's this kind of scholarship that you see helps us redefine what infrastructure is, and urban infrastructure in particular. Then we have seen people think about the different forms of sanitation, like programs such as clean toilets in a few informal settlements in Nairobi, as part of the solution when we're thinking of like sanitation solution in the in different parts of the world. And this becomes then paramount because unfortunately urban planners, particularly like canonical urban planner, continues to refuse this kind of planning of urban spaces. That's why you see a project such as BRT, which I had some stint of like a period I researched on BLT, continues to be insisted as a project that needs to be built on Thika Superhighway. 10 years after, so much money has been wasted on that project, but the government continues to promise we'll finish, but it never becomes a project that can be finished because it does not sit with the context of who is ferrying people on that road, what businesses will be affected. There's so many ways to think of urban space infrastructure, including roads and sanitation, that don't have to be about networked cities. So that's the work in a big, long summary of Southern urbanism and urban theory, and like cities and what is a city and what is not a city.
What's BRT?
Oh, wow, that's a good one. BLT, I have to write it down so that I like rapid transit. What does B mean? But rapid and T, rapid transport. I can just easily Google that.
Okay.
Mm. Mhm.
I would like to tender a request to Sumaya, the founder of the podcast, if we could have a part 2 to talk about urbanism, because I have so many questions which are going to dilute the discussion for today. Because I've been one of the people who questions just how different spaces look like, and perhaps it could be because majority or even our leaders, we think of urbanism in linear way, and maybe informed by like a global north idea of what urbanism is, and which might not work, or think of infrastructure in a limited way. And that's why I like what you mentioned, Mwangi, of thinking of people as an infrastructure. And I think that will that will link it back to, as you said, informalized spaces and people who occupy those spaces. What does urbanism look like there? But I think would really love to be back to chat about that. Thank you, Sumaya. Last question.
Yeah. I think that's nearly a necessary conversation because I always forget that it's like public speakers would say that you need to start with the statistics and say words before you give your point. And that it's clear that urbanism is mostly happening like in Africa. Like I think by 2050, statistics shows that most people will be living in urban spaces in Africa continent, particularly in the world, as we were to think of statistics in that way. So more conversation needs to be had about what is happening in terms of like what infrastructure, what building, what roads, and what like social infrastructure are supported in these spaces. Like, also, and this we can even put in context of like what is happening with Kenya with the protests. Like when we're thinking of different things, we're also thinking of like urban spaces, like spaces that like movement are being made, and movement are also being surveilled in particular ways. So we are here to point like when unfortunately our government, when they think of infrastructure in urban spaces, they would think of a Konza city, which can be a big surveillance space, and would think of like CCTV that are done by Safaricom and Huawei, and become like the infrastructure that then regulate, surveils people as we protest and as we organize in a city like Nairobi and other places in the on the African continent might also be owned. So there is what government, there is what policymakers think as infrastructure, but there's also this kind of scholarship that is pushing back and like trying to show us how to think broadly in this conversation.
Thanks for that, Mwangi. The last question from me. I'm really controlling myself here because I have massive questions, lots of questions. Would be talking about methods and your research approach.
Mm-hmm.
When majority of people, and I'm speaking loosely for people here, think
Mm-hmm.
about choosing to research informalized markets such as Gikomba, the question
Mm-hmm.
of banning secondhand clothing comes to mind,
Mm-hmm.
which you did
Mm-hmm.
mention. So what was it like for you making an entry point into Gikomba, forming relationships with the traders and
Mm-hmm.
doing it in an ethical way such that it's not seen as an interference with their livelihood, but
Mm-hmm.
actually how do you communicate the significance of your work,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and majority of people will be like, so of what importance will this be to me? This is me making the assumption, at least when I'm researching vulnerable
Mm-hmm.
communities. That's one thing that we struggle with, especially coming from a field where you're talking to people who have been very exhausted from constantly being interviewed and being spoken to, but the richness of the content that's produced from them never comes back to them. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much for that question, Rudy. And I have to say it's one that I continue to work through with any community or like any space that I think with and wants to sit with and write about and like I research and like I co-work with. My sense was like when designing my PhD project, sometime 2020. There should be 2023, late 2023, and the whole of 2024 before I started it officially last year, October, was I'm not one to go to a place to just do interview and leave. Like I refuse to do that kind of research that is extractive in that way. And here I also want to recognize that most research often will always be extractive. So my sense was like I have established relationship in this place, both by with my relatives who live and sell there, with the period that I lived there myself. And during the period I would come to visit during my master's, like when I visited home for holiday, there was that continuous like trying to engage with the people. Unfortunately, in a place like Gikomba, there's no organizations. For example, if we were to think of other neighborhood, there's Mathare Social Justice Center, Kayode Social Justice Center, which would be really perfect ground for me to ground myself and continue working with people in that way. So my sense then became like a good ethnography where I am Kenyan. I grew up in Kenya. I speak, Kikuyu, Sheng, English, Swahili. I grew up in a trading family with a dad who is a tailor, so I know my way around clothes or fabric to some extent. I do not, fully know, and it's something I continue to learn. So I can sell with people, and while I want to recognize, like, I do not want to assume that my presence in the market has become natural. Like, I can go in a trader, when I go, I'll sell and I'll be on the vibandas or like the selling point with the people, and I'll be, a trader will tell, like, there are people I'll sell with who will send you around the market. And I really deeply appreciate that when someone is just like, go get us food lunch today from like, I know those spots and all that kind of stuff. So my sense was like, and here I'm not assuming that I'm contributing anything to this to these traders, like they were having a full rhythm when I was not there. And when I'm not there, for example, on a day like today when it's a Thursday and I'm in the office, it's not like their work is not continuing. So I want to recognize like with lots of humility, my positionality here, even as a Kenyan going to this market and selling with the people. My sense is like, well, if this work can contribute to like this global policy, national policies, like the thoughts around like improving Gikomba as a market and the neighborhood itself, I think that's the only way. Like that's one of the ways like my research can be of value to the traders and the residents of Gikomba, and this can look it can look yeah, can pan itself in different ways. Could be contribute to thinking through extended producer responsibility, which is a concept I mentioned before, but which I'm getting lots of like ideas and like feedback by some of the people such as the Africa Collect Textile and other people who work around this industry, that it's not a foolproof of things, that when extended producer responsibility pays, or the producer pays to companies, it will always be global north companies and not the trader in Gikomba who has to deal with the waste. So there's lots of things that we can feed back to such a policy when the world is like now attuned to it. I think France as a country just implemented that organization working, or like public organization working or producing or selling in their country have to implement this as part of their policy. So that I think would be I think that would be my joy if my work would contribute to that. If my work can contribute to a neighborhood organization in Gikomba, Bondeni area, which is the neighborhood that is thinking about how to make sure like water system or like clean or garbage collection works, I think those are the ways like I continue to try ground myself. So I'm not yet there. I'm working towards it, and this will always be a work in progress. And as you can tell, I'm sure as listeners will tell this, that I am yet to have arguments in my project. Like these are very much literature that I've been like pointing to and like making a very broad sense of what happens in the industry. So yeah, I think we need, as researchers, we definitely need to always think about these things when we are designing a project, and not assuming that we are being of too much benefit to these people. Like life continues, so it's very much about because I get that question a lot when you approach someone new in the market about selling with them, and they're like, "Oh, are you the people who are contributing to the idea that secondhand clothes should be banned? You know, they have said they're going to get us out of Gikomba," and that's a genuine fear. And I can easily be that person, like who just goes pretend, or anyone can pretend, and they get all this information only to contribute to such a harmful idea by government and by international spaces. So there's so much as researchers we can do. There's so much humility that we need to have in our work, in our writing, because also you've seen researchers who maybe interacted with them and they felt like really good researcher until you read their journal articles and you're like, I really don't think you're describing Nairobi. I can't relate with anything here, because of the way they're describing people, the kind of terminologies they choose to use. So I think I'm a researcher who continues to refuse to use particular kind of terminologies, particular kind of like frameworks to think through things, who seeks to be grounded and think through the terminologies and the ways and frameworks of the people that I'm working with and learning from. Yeah, thank you.
Wow, I think I've won this week. I'm ready to have my weekend, because I feel very enriched. And Mwangi, perhaps this might not be like clear to you, but I think one benefit, as someone who's not in the same field as you, but someone who has massive interest in urban spaces, particularly Nairobi, which I'm getting to experience with much more agency as an adult, is you've deepened our understanding of the realities of Nairobi as an urban space. And we do thank you for that. I would like us to wrap by taking it back to you. If there's one thing that you'd like listeners to think about as we leave this space, to think about what we've chat about today, what would that be?
Big question. Thank you, Rudy, for the warm way you continue to hold space. Yeah, in so many ways. I've worked with you before, and just being in conversation with you today is like such a lovely experience. One thing for people, which is an act that I think I'm doing both at the market when working with designers and traders and like educators who would think through and like doing something around this industry, is what does your cloth tag tell you about what you're buying or what you're wearing on the day? And I say this as someone who is getting very interested to just document the amount of polyester in our clothes, synthetic fiber, the amount of cotton, and all those. Like, what does that tell you? Like, I do not know whether that will influence you to buy something, whether it will make you not buy something. I don't know what it's doing to me, as you can tell, but that's something I am more and more thinking. And sometimes you'll find a clothes that doesn't have that tag. So that's also something that I think we can sit with and like continue. I think it's part of consuming something. If we do look at like expiry date of a bread, we can also look at the cloth tag and try to think of what it's telling us about the commodity you're about to buy or commodity you're wearing or about to throw away. Yeah. And again, here I insist, and this is something people working in discard studies say, these things are not the consumer is really not the problem at the moment. Like, we are surrounded by hyper consumerism that we do not even notice that it permeates itself into our daily livelihood in so many ways. So global system of like wasting and global system of consumerism are the ones that we're trying to figure a critique to push back on and try to like make better. So it's not that I'm saying, and that's why when I mentioned about my work and someone asked me like, should I buy things from charity shop? Should I buy things from like a Gikomba? And you can see the crisis with people. Please recommend brands I should buy from. It's really not about the consumer often. It's very much bigger system than we can think about. And I know there's argument that, it has to start with us. So that's also an argument that I put there. It can start with what we consume, but we also need to think about like in broader systemic ways and as we're trying to do. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that, Mwangi. For me, if I was to have parting shots as a reflection to what you've said, I'm thinking survival, I'm
Uh-huh.
thinking brands, I'm
Uh-huh.
thinking the tag that you've mentioned, and I'm
Mhm.
thinking class.
Perfect, perfect. Oh, I love it. I love that summary. Thank you so much, Ruby.
Thank you very much, listeners. It's been lovely. Please send us comments and thoughts on what you've heard about this. And please give us a shout out if you think I was a good host. I'd really love to hear that. Thank
You
you
are
all.
such an amazing host, but I know that's for listeners.
Thank you, Mwangi.
Perfect.
I just wanted to say thank you, Mwangi and Ruthie, for the insightful conversation and for being generous with your time. We're going to share all the books Mwangi has mentioned on the show notes below, and we look forward to Ruth coming to have that conversation on urban spaces and what they mean to us, and to reflect upon our urban environment. But thank you so much, everyone.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Sumaya, and the Sera and Sauti community.
Thank you.